Standing in front of 43 relatives at our annual family reunion, my Uncle Richard pointed directly at me and declared to everyone, "She's the family failure, the one who couldn't even finish what we started." The laughter that followed felt like glass breaking in my chest, but what he didn't know was that 3 FBI agents were already parked outside, waiting for my signal. Because the real failure wasn't me, it was the $15 million in federal contracts he'd been stealing for the past decade. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Natalie Brooks, and I learned that sometimes the people who call you worthless are the ones most afraid of what you're actually worth. The morning of the reunion started like every other Cedar Falls summer morning, misty pine air drifting through my apartment windows in Portland, coffee brewing while I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. I'd been dreading this day for months, not because I didn't love my family, but because every year the reunion became another opportunity for Uncle Richard to remind everyone how disappointed he was in my life choices. I pulled on a simple navy dress, the kind that wouldn't draw attention but wouldn't look like I'd given up either. My hands shook slightly as I fastened the small silver necklace my grandmother Helen had given me when I graduated college. She'd whispered to me that day that some gifts are worth more than money, though at 22 I had no idea what she meant. The drive to Cedar Falls took 3 hours through winding mountain roads lined with Douglas firs and the occasional glimpse of the Columbia River below. I'd made this trip countless times growing up, back when my father was alive, and the family dynamics felt different. Back then, Uncle Richard was just my dad's younger brother who ran the family construction business. Now, he was the undisputed patriarch who controlled everything from holiday invitations to business decisions. I parked behind a long line of pickup trucks and SUVs at the Riverside Community Center, a modest building that had hosted our reunions for the past 15 years. The parking lot buzzed with familiar voices, children running between cars, and the scent of barbecue smoke drifting from the pavilion out back. My stomach tightened as I spotted Richard's massive silver truck parked in the prime spot near the entrance, as if he owned the place. Walking toward the building, I caught sight of my cousin Brandon unloading coolers from his truck, his wife helping him arrange what looked like enough food for a small army. Brandon had always been Richard's golden child, the one who joined the family business right out of high school and never questioned a single decision. At 35, he was already being groomed to take over Hartwell Construction, despite having the business acumen of a houseplant. "Natalie!" My Aunt Carmen appeared beside me, wrapping me in one of her signature warm hugs that smelled like vanilla and kindness. "You look wonderful, Mija. How's the new job treating you?" Carmen had married into the family 20 years ago, but somehow managed to maintain her own identity despite Richard's tendency to steamroll anyone who didn't fall in line. She was one of the few relatives who genuinely seemed interested in my life outside of Cedar Falls. "It's challenging, but I love it," I replied, meaning every word. Working as an environmental consultant had given me purpose in ways the family business never could. We just finished a major assessment for a federal restoration project. "That sounds important," she said, her eyes lighting up. "You always were the smart one." Before I could respond, Richard's voice boomed across the parking lot. "Carmen, stop gossiping and help us get the table set up. We've got a schedule to keep." Carmen squeezed my hand and whispered, "Don't let him get to you today, okay?" Then she hurried off to help with whatever task Richard had deemed urgent. I took a deep breath and walked into the community center. The main hall had been transformed with round tables covered in checkered tablecloths, streamers in the family colors of blue and gold, and a banner reading, quote, "Hartwell Family Reunion 2024, stretched across the far wall. The setup was nearly identical to every year before, right down to the positioning of the gift table and the designated area for group photos. My mother, Linda, waved from across the room where she was arranging name tags on a folding table. At 58, she still carried herself with the same quiet grace that had attracted my father 30 years ago, though I could see the tension in her shoulders whenever Richard was around. Being his older sister had never afforded her any special treatment in family matters. "There's my brilliant daughter," she said as I approached, though her voice carried a note of caution. "How was the drive?" "Peaceful," I said, scanning the name tags until I found mine. Unlike the others, which included little family titles like Uncle Rick or Cousin Brandon, mine simply read Natalie. No special designation, no acknowledgement of my place in the family hierarchy. I saved you a spot at table 4, Mom continued, pointing to a table near the back of the room, with the younger cousins and some family friends. Table 4. Not table 1 with the family elders, not table 2 with the successful business owners, not even table 3 with the married couples. Table 4, where they seated the people who didn't quite fit anywhere else. That's fine, I said, though we both knew it wasn't really fine. It was a quiet reminder of where everyone thought I belonged. The reunion officially started at noon with Richard's traditional welcome speech. He stood at the front of the room in his best Western shirt and bolo tie, looking every inch the successful businessman he'd worked decades to become. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his boots polished to a mirror shine, and his smile had the practiced warmth of someone who'd learned to perform leadership rather than live it. Welcome, everyone, to another year of celebrating what it means to be a Hartwell, he began, his voice carrying easily across the room. This family has always been built on hard work, loyalty, and success. We take care of our own, and we don't make excuses for those who can't keep up. I felt several eyes glance in my direction during that last line, though I kept my expression neutral. This was Richard's standard opening, the same speech with minor variations that I'd heard for the past decade. This year has been particularly successful for Hartwell Construction, he continued, his chest puffing with pride. We've secured several major federal contracts that will keep us busy well into the next decade. Projects that will help rebuild America's infrastructure while keeping our family prosperous. Applause rippled through the room, and I found myself wondering exactly which federal contracts he was referring to. In my line of work, I'd become familiar with most of the major infrastructure projects in the Pacific Northwest, but I couldn't recall any recent awards to Hartwell Construction that would justify his level of enthusiasm. But success isn't just about business, Richard went on, his tone shifting slightly. It's about family members who contribute, who build something meaningful, who make choices that honor the Hartwell name. The room grew quieter, and I could feel the energy shifting. This was new territory, even for Richard's typically pointed speeches. Some people in this room understand that responsibility, he said, his eyes sweeping across the tables before landing squarely on me. Others seem to think that running away to the big city and playing environmental activist is more important than family loyalty. My cheeks burned, but I kept my hands steady on the table. Around the room, conversations had stopped entirely. Even the children seemed to sense that something uncomfortable was happening. Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with having different interests, Richard continued, though his tone suggested exactly the opposite. But when someone repeatedly turns their back on opportunities to contribute to the family business, when they choose ideology over practicality, when they consistently demonstrate that they're more interested in criticizing successful people than becoming one themselves. He paused, letting the silence stretch until it became unbearable. Well, at some point, you have to call it what it is. Natalie Brooks, my own niece, is a perfect example of what happens when someone chooses to be a failure instead of a success. The words hit like a physical blow, not because they were unexpected, but because he'd said them in front of everyone. Aunts and uncles I'd grown up respecting, cousins I'd played with as a child, family friends who'd watched me graduate high school with honors. All of them now staring at me while Richard smiled with satisfaction. I felt my mother's hand find mine under the table, her grip tight with shared humiliation. Aunt Carmen's face had gone pale with shock, and even Brandon looked uncomfortable with his father's public cruelty. But the strangest thing was what I felt in that moment.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Not devastation, not anger, not even surprise. What I felt was clarity. Because sitting there, being called a failure in front of my entire family, I realized that Richard was absolutely right about one thing. One of us was definitely a failure. It just wasn't me. Standing slowly, I managed a calm smile and said, "You know what, Uncle Richard? You're absolutely right. There is a failure in this family. But I think everyone deserves to know the whole truth about failure. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone, scrolling to a contact I'd saved just 3 days earlier. Agent Patricia Kim, FBI Financial Crimes Division. I think it's time everyone learned about the $15 million in fraudulent federal contracts, the environmental violations being covered up on federal land, and the bribes being paid to government officials. Richard's face went from smug satisfaction to genuine panic in the span of 3 seconds. You see, I continued, my voice steady despite my racing heart. I may have chosen environmental consulting over construction, but that choice led me to some very interesting discoveries about Hartwell Construction's recent projects. Discoveries that the FBI has been very interested in hearing about. I pressed send on a text message that simply read, "Now." The real failure, I said, looking directly at Richard, is thinking that calling someone worthless would stop them from exposing the truth. The room had gone completely silent, not the uncomfortable quiet of social awkwardness, but the absolute stillness that comes when everyone realizes they're witnessing something that will change everything. Through the windows facing the parking lot, I could see 3 black SUVs pulling up to the building. Men and women in dark suits were already getting out, their movements purposeful and coordinated. Richard tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, but no sound came out. Diane grabbed his arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his western shirt. "What did you do?" he finally managed to whisper. I smiled with genuine warmth for the first time all day. "I did exactly what you taught me, Uncle Richard. I finished what I started." The community center's front doors opened, and Agent Patricia Kim walked in, her badge visible on her belt, followed by 2 other agents and a man I recognized as a federal prosecutor from Portland. "Richard Hartwell?" Agent Kim's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "We need to speak with you about some irregularities in your federal contracting procedures." The family reunion had officially become something else entirely, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one who didn't belong. As Richard was led away from the table where he'd just called me a failure, I caught my grandmother Helen's eye across the room. She was 91 years old, sharp as ever, and sitting in her wheelchair with a slight smile on her weathered face. She mouthed 2 words to me. "Well done." The little silver necklace she'd given me years ago suddenly felt heavier around my neck, and I finally understood what she'd meant about some gifts being worth more than money. Sometimes the most valuable thing you can give someone is the truth, even when it costs everything to deliver it. Especially then. The reunion was far from over, but my real family education was just beginning. The community center erupted into chaos the moment Agent Kim finished reading Richard his Miranda rights. Folding chairs scraped against linoleum as family members stood, voices rising in confusion and disbelief. Children started crying, sensing the adult panic without understanding its source. Diane Hartwell collapsed into her chair, hyperventilating while Aunt Carmen rushed to fan her with a paper plate. I remained seated, watching the scene unfold with an odd sense of detachment. 3 months of sleepless nights had led to this moment, 3 months of carefully documenting evidence while pretending everything was normal during family phone calls. The relief I felt was overwhelming, like finally exhaling after holding my breath underwater. Agent Kim approached our table while her colleagues secured Richard near the entrance. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe early 40s, with steel gray hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that missed nothing. When she'd first contacted me 6 weeks ago, I'd been terrified. Now, seeing her calm professionalism in the midst of family hysteria, I felt grateful. "Miss Brooks, we'll need you to come with us for a formal debriefing," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the commotion. "Your cooperation has been invaluable, but we need to document everything properly now." My mother squeezed my hand so tightly I could feel her wedding ring digging into my fingers. "Natalie, what's happening? I don't understand any of this." Looking at her confused, frightened face, I realized how completely I'd hidden my investigation from everyone I loved. Mom had no idea that for months I'd been photographing documents during family gatherings, recording conversations, and piecing together a financial puzzle that reached far beyond Cedar Falls. "I'll explain everything later, Mom, I promise. I kissed her cheek and stood, my legs unsteady after sitting so long. Just know that I had to do this. He was stealing from the government, and people were going to get hurt. Brandon appeared at my elbow, his face flushed with anger and confusion. Natalie, this is insane. My dad's not perfect, but he's not a criminal. Whatever you think you found, you're wrong. I turned to face my cousin, this man I'd played hide and seek with in our grandmother's attic, who'd taught me to ride a bike when I was 7. Brandon, I have 15 months of financial records showing systematic overbilling on federal projects. I have emails discussing bribes to EPA officials. I have photographs of environmental violations on protected wetlands. His expression shifted from anger to something approaching fear. You don't know what you're talking about. Those projects are legitimate. The Cascade River Restoration Project, the Mount Hood Forest Service Roads, the Columbia Gorge Erosion Control Initiative. I watched his face grow paler with each name. Were you really never curious why your dad suddenly became so interested in environmental work? Why Hartwell Construction started bidding on projects completely outside your usual expertise? Agent Kim stepped closer. Mr. Hartwell, we'll be speaking with you as well. Your name appears on several of the fraudulent documents. Brandon's face went ashen. For the first time, I saw him as something other than the golden child, the heir apparent to a construction empire. I saw him as a young man who'd never questioned his father's success because he'd been too comfortable enjoying its benefits. Across the room, Richard was being escorted toward the exit, his hands cuffed behind his back. Family members pressed against the windows, watching in stunned silence as federal agents loaded him into one of the black SUVs. Diane followed behind, sobbing into a tissue while a female agent spoke to her in low, reassuring tones. Grandmother Helen's wheelchair sat near the dessert table, surrounded by several great-grandchildren who were too young to understand why the party had suddenly ended. She caught my eye and beckoned me over with one arthritic finger. "Natalie, dear, come here for a moment." I walked over, acutely aware that most of the family was watching my every move. Some faces showed confusion, others anger, and a few reflected what might have been grudging respect. Aunt Carmen nodded at me encouragingly, though tears streamed down her cheeks. "Grandmother, I'm sorry this happened at the reunion. I never wanted to ruin the family gathering." Helen reached for my hand with fingers that felt like dry paper, but still held surprising strength. "Child, do you remember what I told you when you graduated college? About gifts being worth more than money?" I nodded, touching the silver necklace she'd given me that day. "This family has been built on secrets and silence for too long," she said, her voice carrying the authority of 9 decades. "Your grandfather, God rest his soul, always said that the truth has a way of surfacing eventually. Better to bring it to light yourself than have it dragged out by strangers." She paused, studying my face with eyes that had witnessed the construction of the family business from the ground up. "What you did took courage, Natalie. Real courage, not the kind that comes from bullying people at family gatherings." Agent Kim returned to my side, holding a briefcase and what looked like official paperwork. "Ms. Brooks, we need to leave now. The debriefing will take several hours, and there are additional documents we need you to review." I hugged my grandmother carefully, mindful of her fragile bones, and whispered, "I love you. I love you too, dear. And I'm proud of you." The drive to the FBI field office in Portland passed in a blur of pine trees and afternoon shadows. I sat in the back seat of Agent Kim's SUV, staring out the window while she and her partner discussed logistics in the front. The surreal nature of the day was starting to hit me. 6 hours ago, I'd been dreading small talk about my career choices. Now I was a key witness in a federal investigation that could send my uncle to prison for decades. Agent Kim had explained the basics when she first contacted me. Someone had filed an anonymous complaint about Hartwell Construction's environmental practices on a federal project. During their initial investigation, auditors had discovered billing irregularities that suggested systematic fraud. But they needed someone with access to internal company documents, someone who understood both the construction industry and environmental regulations. Someone like me. The FBI field office in downtown Portland was nothing like the dramatic glass towers you see in movies. It was a modest building with beige walls and fluorescent lighting, the kind of place where serious work got done without fanfare. Agent Kim led me through a maze of cubicles to a small conference room, where another agent waited with thick folders spread across the table. "Ms. Brooks, this is Agent Michael Rodriguez from our white-collar crime division. He'll be handling the financial aspects of the case while I focus on the environmental violations." Agent Rodriguez was perhaps 50, with graying temples and the patient demeanor of someone who'd spent years untangling complex financial schemes. He gestured to a chair across from him and smiled reassuringly. "I know this must be overwhelming, but what you've provided us with has been extraordinary. Rarely do we see a case where someone has documented criminal activity so thoroughly from the inside." Over the next 4 hours, we went through everything. Every photograph I'd taken of billing documents during family barbecues. Every recording I'd made using my phone during conversations where Richard had discussed bribes and kickbacks. Every email I'd screenshot from the shared company computer during the brief period when I'd helped with bookkeeping the previous summer. The scope of the fraud was staggering. Richard had been systematically overbilling the federal government for materials and labor, sometimes by as much as 300%. He'd created shell companies to disguise the flow of money, paid bribes to EPA officials to overlook environmental violations, and falsified progress reports to justify continued funding for projects that were nowhere near completion. "How did you first realize what was happening?" Agent Rodriguez asked, making notes on a legal pad. I thought back to the moment everything had clicked into place. "It was during a family dinner last Thanksgiving." Richard was bragging about winning the Cascade River project, but something felt off. I'd worked on similar restoration projects, and his timeline didn't make sense. The budget numbers were way too high for the scope of work involved. "So you started investigating." At first, I just asked casual questions. But then I noticed discrepancies in the environmental impact reports. Areas that were supposed to be protected were showing signs of heavy machinery damage. When I tried to bring it up with Richard, he shut me down immediately. Agent Kim leaned forward. "That's when you decided to gather evidence?" I started small. Taking pictures during family gatherings when Richard would leave documents around his home office. Recording conversations when he'd had too much to drink and started boasting about how easy it was to manipulate government bureaucrats. The agents exchanged glances that suggested I'd provided them with more comprehensive evidence than they'd dared hope for. Agent Rodriguez opened one of the thick folders and pulled out a series of photographs. "These are surveillance photos we took at various project sites over the past 2 months. Can you help us identify what we're seeing here?" The photos showed environmental devastation that made my stomach turn. Ancient trees cut down in areas that were supposed to be protected. Heavy machinery operating in sensitive wetlands. Construction debris dumped directly into streams that fed the Columbia River. "This is the Cascade River site," I said, pointing to the first set of photos. According to the contract, they were supposed to build temporary bridges to avoid disturbing the riverbank. Instead, they just drove equipment straight through the water. And the environmental impact of that? Catastrophic. You're looking at decades of ecosystem damage. The salmon spawning grounds alone will take years to recover, if they ever do. Agent Kim made notes while I continued identifying violations in each photograph. The picture that emerged was of a company that had treated federal environmental protections as minor inconveniences to be bypassed rather than legal requirements to be followed. "Ms. Brooks, I have to ask," Agent Rodriguez said, his tone becoming more serious. "This level of documentation required significant time and risk on your part. What motivated you to pursue this so thoroughly?" I thought about Richard's smug smile, as he'd called me a failure in front of my entire family. About all the times he'd dismissed my environmental work as meaningless activism. About the way he'd made me feel like my values were somehow less important than his profits. My uncle spent years telling me that environmental protection was for people who couldn't handle real business. That caring about ecosystems was a luxury for people who didn't understand economic reality. I paused, remembering the moment I'd seen those first destroyed wetlands. But when I saw what his real business was actually doing to the environment, I realized that someone had to care. Someone had to document what was happening and make sure there were consequences. Agent Kim nodded approvingly. Environmental crimes often go undetected because the victims can't speak for themselves. Trees and rivers don't file complaints. Exactly, and Richard knew that. He counted on the fact that nobody would notice or care enough to investigate. He thought environmental regulations were just paperwork obstacles that could be ignored if you were smart enough about it. Agent Rodriguez gathered the photographs back into their folder. Well, his calculation was wrong. Because someone did notice, and someone did care enough to risk family relationships to expose the truth. The formal debriefing continued until well past sunset. By the time Agent Kim drove me back to Cedar Falls to collect my car, the community center was dark and empty. My Toyota sat alone in the parking lot, looking somehow smaller and more vulnerable than it had that morning. "What happens now?" I asked as Agent Kim pulled up beside my car. "Richard will be arraigned tomorrow morning. The federal prosecutor will likely offer him a plea deal in exchange for cooperating with the investigation into his government contacts. Either way, he's looking at significant prison time. And the family business? All federal contracts will be suspended immediately. There will be a complete audit of company finances going back 5 years. Depending on what we find, the company might survive, but it will never be the same." I sat in my car for a long time after Agent Kim drove away, staring at the empty community center and thinking about the family reunion that would never be spoken of in quite the same way again. My phone buzzed with text messages that I wasn't ready to read, voicemails from relatives demanding explanations I didn't have the energy to provide. Instead, I drove home to Portland through mountain roads that seemed different somehow, as if the landscape itself had been altered by the day's revelations. The truth was out now, spreading through the family network like wildfire, and there would be no way to contain or control it. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe properly. The weight of carrying secrets, of knowing terrible things while pretending ignorance, had been crushing me without my even realizing it. Now that burden belonged to the justice system, where it had always belonged. But as I pulled into my apartment complex and saw the familiar glow of my living room windows, I also realized that my relationship with my family would never be the same. Some bridges, once burned, can never be rebuilt, even when burning them was the right thing to do. Tomorrow would bring arraignments and media coverage and phone calls from relatives who would want to know how I could have betrayed family loyalty for abstract principles like environmental protection and government accountability. Tonight, though, I was simply a woman who had stood up to a bully and won, even though the victory felt more complicated than I'd expected it to be. Monday morning arrived with the kind of gray drizzle that Portland was famous for, and my phone had been buzzing non-stop since 5:30. Local news stations had picked up the story overnight, and somehow my name had leaked as the whistleblower who brought down Cedar Falls' most prominent businessman. I stood at my kitchen window, watching reporters set up equipment in the parking lot of my apartment complex, their bright umbrellas creating small islands of color against the concrete. My boss at Environmental Solutions Inc., Dr. Marcus Chen, had called twice before 7, asking if I needed time off. The irony wasn't lost on me that the same environmental consulting work Richard had mocked for years was now being praised by federal prosecutors as essential to stopping ecological disasters. My expertise in wetland restoration and federal environmental compliance had made me the perfect person to recognize the scope of his crimes. The coffee maker gurgled to life as I scrolled through news headlines on my laptop. Local construction baron charged with environmental fraud. Family whistleblower exposes $15 million scam. Cedar Falls company accused of destroying protected ecosystems. Each article painted Richard as either a criminal mastermind or a small-town businessman who got in over his head. None of them captured the complexity of a man who could teach his nephew to fish while simultaneously poisoning the river. A sharp knock on my door interrupted my reading. Through the peephole, I saw Tyler Morrison standing in the hallway, holding 2 takeout coffee cups, and wearing the concerned expression I'd grown to appreciate over our 6 months of dating. Tyler worked as a renewable energy engineer, and his quiet integrity had been one of the things that attracted me to him from the beginning. "I brought reinforcements," he said when I opened the door, handing me one of the cups. Figured you might need caffeine and moral support. How did you get past the reporters? Told them I was delivering food to a different apartment. They're not exactly investigative journalists. He kissed my forehead gently. How are you holding up? I led him to the couch, grateful for his presence in my suddenly chaotic world. Tyler was one of the few people who'd known about my FBI cooperation from the beginning, and his support had kept me sane during the months of secret evidence gathering. I keep waiting to feel guilty about destroying my family's business, but mostly I just feel relieved. You didn't destroy anything, Nat. You exposed something that was already rotten. He settled beside me, his arm wrapping around my shoulders. Richard made his choices. You just made sure there were consequences. My phone rang again, displaying a number I didn't recognize. I'd been ignoring unknown calls all morning, but this one had a Cedar Falls area code. Against my better judgment, I answered. Natalie Brooks? The voice was elderly, wavering slightly with what sounded like nervous energy. This is Natalie. This is Frank Kellerman. I worked for your uncle for 12 years, foreman, on most of his bigger projects. I straightened, recognizing the name from some of the documents I'd provided to the FBI. Mr. Kellerman, I'm not sure I should be talking to anyone connected to the case right now. Please, just listen for a minute. I need you to know that not everyone who worked for Richard knew what he was doing. Some of us tried to do the jobs right, even when he pressured us to cut corners. Tyler watched my face, ready to take the phone if I needed him to end the conversation. But something in Frank's voice made me want to hear what he had to say. I've been carrying guilt about those environmental violations for 2 years, Frank continued. Richard told us the EPA paperwork was just bureaucratic nonsense, that the real work was what mattered. But I knew better. I've lived in these mountains my whole life, and I could see what we were doing to the land. Why didn't you report it yourself? Because I'm 61 years old with diabetes and no college degree. Richard made it clear that anyone who caused problems would never work construction in this county again. I couldn't afford to lose my job, not with my wife's medical bills. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Frank describing the pressure Richard had put on his workers to prioritize speed and profit over environmental compliance. He painted a picture of a workplace where questioning orders led to immediate dismissal, where corner cutting was rewarded and ethical concerns were treated as character flaws. I just wanted you to know that what you did took guts, Frank said before hanging up, and there are a lot of us who are grateful someone finally stood up to him. By noon, I'd received similar calls from 3 other Hartwell Construction employees, each describing a workplace culture where environmental violations were normalized and criticism was silenced. Their stories filled in details about Richard's operation that even my careful documentation had missed. These weren't just financial crimes, they were systematic attacks on worker safety and environmental protection that had been going on for years. Agent Kim called at 1 o'clock, her voice carrying a professional satisfaction that suggested good news. Natalie, we've had some significant developments since yesterday. Richard's arraignment went as expected, but more importantly, 2 of his government contacts have already reached out about plea agreements. Government contacts? EPA Regional Supervisor named Dennis Walsh and a Forest Service contracting officer named Jennifer Huang. Apparently, your uncle kept detailed records of his bribe payments, including bank transaction records and email confirmations. He was either supremely confident he'd never be caught, or completely paranoid about being double-crossed. I walked to my living room window, where reporters were still camped out despite the steady rain. What does that mean for the case? It means we have corroborating evidence from multiple sources. Walsh has already admitted to accepting $43,000 in bribes over 18 months in exchange for overlooking environmental violations. Huang received $27,000 for expediting permit approvals on projects that should never have been approved. The scope of the corruption was staggering. These weren't isolated incidents or momentary lapses in judgment. They represented a systematic network of fraud that had been operating under everyone's noses for years. There's something else, Agent Kim continued. We've discovered that Richard wasn't working alone within the family business. Brandon's involvement goes much deeper than we initially thought. My stomach dropped. Despite everything, I'd hoped my cousin had been an unwitting participant in his father's schemes. How deep? He signed off on several of the fraudulent billing reports, and his signature appears on environmental impact assessments that he had to know were falsified. We're bringing him in for questioning this afternoon. After Agent Kim hung up, I sat in stunned silence for several minutes. Brandon's involvement transformed this from a story about one corrupt businessman into something much more complicated. My cousin had grown up in the same family I had, with the same grandmother who taught us about integrity and hard work. At what point had he decided that profit mattered more than principles? Tyler squeezed my hand. You okay? I keep thinking about Brandon when we were kids. He was the one who taught me to identify different types of trees during our camping trips. He actually cared about nature back then. People change, Nat. Sometimes not for the better. My mother called at 2:30, her voice strained with exhaustion and confusion. Natalie, I need to understand what's happening. The reporters are saying Brandon might be arrested too. Is that true? I don't know, Mom. The investigation is ongoing. But you must know something. You're working with them. I could hear the accusation in her voice, the suggestion that I was somehow controlling events rather than simply responding to them. I provided evidence about crimes I discovered. I don't control what the FBI does with that evidence. Crimes. She repeated the word like it tasted bitter. Natalie, these are our family members. Richard helped pay for your college education. Brandon was at your high school graduation. These aren't strangers you're destroying. The conversation that followed was perhaps the most difficult of my adult life. My mother, caught between loyalty to her family and the growing evidence of their criminal behavior, struggled to understand how her daughter could have chosen strangers and law enforcement over blood relatives. She didn't use the word betrayal, but it hung between us like smoke. Mom, if you saw someone poisoning the water supply, would you stay quiet because you knew them personally? That's different. How is it different? Richard was destroying protected ecosystems that provide clean water and wildlife habitat for thousands of people. He was stealing money from federal programs designed to repair environmental damage. How is that different from any other kind of poisoning? The line went quiet for a long moment. When my mother spoke again, her voice was smaller, more uncertain. I just never thought our family was capable of something like this. Neither did I, Mom. That's what made it so hard to accept. By late afternoon, the media circus outside my apartment had grown to include 3 television news crews and what appeared to be a reporter from a Portland newspaper. My landlord had called twice asking when they might leave, and several neighbors had complained about the disruption. The story was taking on a life of its own, expanding beyond the simple narrative of environmental crime into something larger about family loyalty and moral courage. At 4 o'clock, my phone rang with another Cedar Falls number. This time it was Diane Hartwell, Richard's wife, and her voice was barely controlled hysteria. Natalie, please, you have to stop this. Richard is talking about a plea deal that would send him to prison for 15 years. 15 years! We have grandchildren who won't even remember him if he's gone that long. Diane, I'm not involved in plea negotiations. That's between Richard's lawyer and the federal prosecutor. But you could tell them he's not a bad man. You could explain that he was just trying to provide for his family. You know him, Natalie. You know he's not a monster. The desperation in her voice was heartbreaking, but it also revealed something important about how Richard's family had rationalized his behavior for years. In their minds, providing financial security for loved ones justified any means necessary, including environmental destruction and government fraud. Diane, I can't testify that crimes didn't happen when I have evidence that they did, and I can't pretend that good intentions excuse harmful actions. So you'll let him rot in prison for the rest of his life? I'll let the justice system decide what consequences are appropriate for his choices. After Diane hung up, I found myself thinking about the different ways people process moral complexity. For Diane, Richard's role as provider and patriarch outweighed his role as environmental criminal. For me, his crimes against public trust and ecological systems outweighed his personal relationships. Neither perspective was entirely wrong, but they couldn't coexist. Agent Rodriguez called at 6 to inform me that Brandon had indeed been arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit fraud and environmental crimes. His bail hearing was scheduled for the following morning, and prosecutors were expecting him to cooperate in exchange for reduced charges. What does cooperation mean in this context? Providing details about the internal operations of Hartwell Construction, identifying other employees who might have been involved, and testifying against his father if the case goes to trial. The thought of Brandon testifying against Richard felt like the final dissolution of family bonds that had already been stretched to breaking. Whatever happened in court, the Hartwell family as I'd known it was effectively over. Thanksgiving dinners and Christmas gatherings and summer reunions would never be the same, if they happened at all. That evening, Tyler and I ordered Chinese food and ate it while watching the local news coverage of the case. The lead story featured interviews with environmental groups praising the investigation, business leaders expressing shock at the allegations, and Cedar Falls residents trying to process the idea that their most successful businessman had been systematically breaking federal law. One interview particularly caught my attention. It featured Dr. Elena Vasquez, a wildlife biologist who had been studying salmon populations in the Columbia River watershed. She stood beside a stream that had been damaged by Hartwell construction equipment, pointing to areas where erosion had destroyed spawning grounds. The environmental damage from these projects will take decades to repair, Dr. Vasquez explained to the reporter. We're talking about the destruction of ecosystems that support endangered species, contamination of water supplies, and loss of forest habitat that can never be fully restored. Watching her describe the ecological impact of Richard's crimes, I felt a renewed sense of conviction about my decision to cooperate with federal investigators. This wasn't just about family dynamics or business ethics. It was about protecting irreplaceable natural resources for future generations. The news segment concluded with a brief statement from Richard's attorney, a sharp-dressed Portland lawyer who specialized in white-collar criminal defense. He promised to vigorously defend his client against what he characterized as overzealous prosecution of standard business practices. The statement felt like preparation for a defense strategy that would minimize Richard's crimes as technical violations rather than intentional environmental destruction. As Tyler and I prepared for bed, I realized that the hardest parts of this experience were still ahead. Court proceedings would drag on for months, keeping the case in the public eye and forcing me to relive the investigation over and over through testimony and cross-examination. Media attention would continue, making privacy impossible and turning my personal decisions into public debate topics. But lying in bed that night, listening to rain against the windows and Tyler's steady breathing beside me, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: peace with my choices. The truth was out, consequences were unfolding, and justice was slowly working its way through the system. My phone buzzed with a final text message of the day, this one from Aunt Carmen. "Misha, I know this is hard, but you did the right thing. Some of us understand that love sometimes means holding people accountable for their actions." I turned off the phone and closed my eyes, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new revelations, and new consequences for decisions that had started with a simple observation about environmental violations and ended with the destruction of everything I'd thought I knew about my family. The truth, as my grandmother had always said, has a way of surfacing eventually. Better to bring it to light yourself than have it dragged out by strangers. Tonight, at least, I could sleep knowing I'd chosen light over darkness, even when the illumination revealed things I'd preferred not to see. The federal courthouse in Portland felt like a cathedral of justice, with its towering marble columns and ornate ceiling that seemed designed to remind everyone of the weight of proceedings that took place within its walls. I sat in the gallery wearing my best navy suit, the same one I'd worn to job interviews and important client presentations, trying to project confidence I didn't entirely feel. 8 months had passed since the family reunion that changed everything, and today Richard would finally face the consequences of his choices. The courtroom was packed with reporters, environmental activists, and what appeared to be half the population of Cedar Falls. I recognized faces from childhood birthday parties and high school football games, people who had watched me grow up and were now watching me testify against my own uncle. The weight of their stares felt heavier than the marble architecture surrounding us. Federal prosecutor Amanda Sterling stood at the podium with the kind of quiet authority that comes from years of building cases against white-collar criminals. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe early 40s, with auburn hair pulled back in a professional chignon, and the focused intensity of someone who genuinely believed in the importance of her work. During our preparation sessions, she'd impressed me with her thorough understanding of both environmental law and the personal dynamics that had made this case so complicated. "Your Honor," she began, addressing Judge Patricia Thornton, The government will demonstrate that Richard Hartwell orchestrated a systematic scheme to defraud federal environmental programs while knowingly causing irreparable damage to protected ecosystems. This wasn't a case of minor regulatory oversights or paperwork errors. This was deliberate, calculated criminal activity that spanned multiple years and multiple federal agencies. Richard sat at the defendant's table between his two attorneys, looking smaller somehow than he had at the family reunion. Prison jumpsuit had replaced his Western shirts, and the confident swagger that had dominated family gatherings was nowhere to be seen. He'd aged visibly during the months in custody, his silver hair now more gray than gleaming, his face carrying the weight of a man watching his life's work crumble in public. Beside him, his lead attorney, James Crawford, shuffled through legal documents with the methodical precision of someone who'd defended countless wealthy clients against federal charges. Crawford had a reputation for creating reasonable doubt, even in cases with overwhelming evidence. And I knew the next few days would test every piece of documentation I'd provided to investigators. Judge Thornton called the court to order, and Prosecutor Sterling launched into her opening statement with a systematic destruction of Richard's defense strategy. She outlined the financial trail that showed $15 million in fraudulent billing, described the environmental devastation captured in FBI surveillance photos, and explained how bribes to government officials had enabled the scheme to continue for years without detection. The defendant's niece, Natalie Brooks, will testify about her uncle's own admissions of criminal activity, admissions she documented through careful observation and recording over several months. Ms. Brooks is an environmental consultant with extensive experience in federal restoration projects, making her uniquely qualified to recognize the scope and severity of these crimes. I felt my stomach tighten as she mentioned my upcoming testimony. 8 months of preparation hadn't eliminated the anxiety of facing cross-examination from Crawford, who would undoubtedly try to portray me as a disgruntled family member seeking revenge, rather than a concerned citizen protecting public resources. Crawford's opening statement took a predictably different approach. He painted Richard as a small-town businessman who'd gotten in over his head with complex federal regulations, a man whose intentions were honorable even if his execution was flawed. He described me as someone with personal grievances against the family business, motivated by ideology rather than evidence. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Crawford said, his voice carrying the polished cadence of someone who'd perfected the art of reasonable doubt. "This case is about a family torn apart by competing visions of success. Ms. Brooks chose environmental activism over family loyalty, and when her uncle didn't embrace her values, she decided to destroy him using the power of federal law enforcement." The characterization stung, even though Sterling had prepared me for it. Crawford was skilled at taking partial truths and weaving them into narratives that obscured larger realities. Yes, I disagreed with Richard's business practices. Yes, I'd chosen environmental protection over family harmony. But reducing my decision to personal grievance ignored the mountain of evidence documenting serious crimes. The prosecution's case unfolded over 3 days with the methodical precision of a construction project, each witness and exhibit building upon previous testimony until the full scope of Richard's criminal enterprise became undeniable. EPA officials described the bribes they'd received and the violations they'd agreed to overlook. Forest Service employees explained how fraudulent environmental impact assessments had been approved despite obvious inaccuracies. FBI agents walked the jury through financial records, showing money flowing from federal accounts to Richard's personal investments. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the wildlife biologist I'd seen on television, provided devastating testimony about the ecological damage caused by Richard's projects. She brought photographs of destroyed wetlands, charts showing declining salmon populations, and water quality data demonstrating contamination that would take decades to remediate. Her expertise transformed abstract environmental violations into concrete harm that even non-scientists could understand. The defendant's projects destroyed spawning habitat for 3 endangered salmon species. Dr. Vasquez explained, pointing to before and after photographs that showed pristine streams reduced to muddy construction zones. The equipment he used in these sensitive areas caused erosion that will continue affecting water quality long after the construction was completed. Crawford tried to challenge her methodology and question whether the environmental damage could be definitively linked to Hartwell construction, But Dr. Vasquez had 30 years of field experience and peer-reviewed research backing every statement. Her calm professionalism made Crawford's attack seem desperate rather than legitimate. Brandon's testimony on the fourth day was perhaps the most difficult to watch. My cousin looked like he'd aged 5 years and 8 months, his usual confidence replaced by the hollow expression of someone who'd lost everything he'd thought he could count on. He'd accepted a plea agreement in exchange for cooperating with prosecutors, but his cooperation came at the cost of testifying against his own father. Brandon, did your father ask you to sign environmental impact reports that you knew contained false information? Sterling asked. Yes. The word came out barely above a whisper. And did you sign those reports knowing they contained false information? Yes. Why did you agree to sign documents you knew were fraudulent? Brandon looked across the courtroom toward where Diane sat in the gallery, her face streaked with tears. Because he told me that environmental regulations were just bureaucratic obstacles, and that real businessmen found ways around obstacles. I trusted him. I believed him when he said we weren't really hurting anything. The exchange continued for over an hour, with Brandon describing a workplace culture where questioning Richard's decisions was discouraged, and environmental compliance was treated as optional. He admitted to signing off on billing reports that he knew were inflated, to ignoring worker safety violations that could have endangered lives, and to participating in meetings where bribes to government officials were discussed openly. Crawford's cross-examination of Brandon was brutal, but ultimately ineffective. He tried to portray my cousin as an opportunist who was lying to save himself from prison, but Brandon's obvious anguish made the accusations ring hollow. This wasn't someone seeking advantage through deception. This was someone who'd been forced to choose between loyalty to his father and accountability for criminal actions. Isn't it true, Mr. Hartwell, that you're only testifying against your father because prosecutors threatened you with decades in prison? They offered me a plea agreement, yes. And that plea agreement requires you to say whatever prosecutors want you to say about your father's actions? No, Brandon's voice grew stronger. The plea agreement requires me to tell the truth about what I saw and what I did. Everything I've testified to today is true. My own testimony began on the 5th day, and I walked to the witness stand with legs that felt distinctly unsteady. 8 months of depositions and preparation sessions hadn't eliminated the surreal feeling of testifying against my uncle in front of dozens of family members. Sterling had warned me that Crawford would try to rattle me with personal attacks, but intellectual preparation was different from emotional readiness. Sterling guided me through my background in environmental consulting, my familiarity with federal restoration projects, and my history with Hartwell Construction. She established my expertise in recognizing environmental violations, and my access to internal company documents through family gatherings and temporary employment. Ms. Brooks, what first made you suspicious that Hartwell Construction might be violating environmental regulations? The Cascade River project timeline didn't make sense. My uncle was claiming progress on restoration work that should have taken months longer to complete properly. When I visited the site, I saw heavy machinery operating in areas that were supposed to be protected wetlands. What did you do with those observations? I started documenting what I saw, taking photographs when possible, recording conversations where my uncle discussed the projects, and researching the specific environmental requirements that were being violated. Sterling walked me through the evidence I'd gathered, playing recordings of Richard bragging about bribing EPA officials and describing environmental regulations as nonsense created by tree huggers who never built anything in their lives. The jury listened intently as Richard's own voice echoed through the courtroom, his casual dismissal of federal law contrasting sharply with his current position as Crawford's cross-examination began with an attempt to undermine my credibility through personal attacks. He questioned my motivations, suggesting I'd been excluded from family business decisions and sought revenge through federal prosecutors. He implied that my environmental consulting work had radicalized me against the construction industry and made me unable to assess my uncle's actions objectively. Ms. Brooks, isn't it true that you've always resented your uncle's success in business? No, that's not true. Isn't it true that you disagreed with his business practices long before you discovered any evidence of criminal activity? I disagreed with some of his environmental practices, yes, but I didn't set out to find evidence of crimes. I discovered criminal activity while trying to understand why his project timelines seemed unrealistic. And once you discovered what you believed to be criminal activity, you immediately contacted federal law enforcement rather than discussing your concerns with family members. I tried to discuss my concerns with my uncle directly. He made it clear that questioning his methods wasn't welcome. Crawford continued for hours, trying to paint me as an ideological extremist who'd betrayed family loyalty for environmental activism. He questioned the legality of my recording methods, the completeness of my documentation, and the accuracy of my interpretations of what I'd observed. But Sterling had prepared me well for his tactics, and I was able to answer each question calmly while providing specific details that supported my testimony. The most difficult moment came when Crawford displayed a photograph from the family reunion, where Richard had called me a failure. The image showed me sitting at table 4, isolated from the family leadership, looking uncomfortable and out of place. Ms. Brooks, this photograph was taken at the family reunion where you arranged for FBI agents to arrest your uncle. You appear to be sitting alone, separated from the rest of your family. Doesn't this image suggest someone who felt excluded and resentful? That photograph shows someone who was excluded, yes. But my uncle's decision to humiliate me publicly doesn't change the fact that he committed federal crimes. But it does explain your motivation for seeking revenge, doesn't it? My motivation was protecting public resources from criminal exploitation. Personal feelings didn't factor into my decision to cooperate with federal investigators. The exchange continued for another hour, but Crawford had overplayed his hand. By focusing so heavily on family dynamics, he'd inadvertently reinforced the evidence of Richard's crimes, while failing to provide any legitimate defense for environmental fraud and bribery. Closing arguments took place on a Friday afternoon, with both sides making final appeals to a jury that had spent 2 weeks absorbing detailed evidence of systematic criminal activity. Sterling methodically reviewed the financial evidence, the environmental documentation, and the witness testimony that established Richard's guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Crawford made one last attempt to portray Richard as a businessman who'd made mistakes, rather than a criminal who'd committed deliberate fraud. He argued that environmental regulations were complex and confusing, that Richard had relied on expert advice that proved incorrect, and that the government was criminalizing normal business practices to satisfy environmental extremists. The jury deliberated for 7 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all charges: conspiracy to commit fraud, environmental crimes, bribery of federal officials, and money laundering. Richard showed no emotion as the verdicts were read, but Diane's sobs echoed through the courtroom like a physical presence. Judge Thornton scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later, giving both sides time to prepare impact statements and sentencing memoranda. As court officers led Richard away in handcuffs, he turned to look at me for the first time during the trial. His expression wasn't angry or accusatory. It was something closer to resignation, the look of someone who'd finally accepted that actions have consequences. Walking out of the courthouse into Portland's autumn sunshine, I felt the strange mixture of relief and sadness that comes with the end of long struggles. Justice had been served, but at the cost of family relationships that would never heal. The truth had emerged, but it had illuminated realities that were painful for everyone involved. Agent Kim waited on the courthouse steps, her professional demeanor softened by what appeared to be genuine satisfaction with the outcome. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Like I can finally breathe properly," I said, and realized it was true. The weight of carrying secrets, of knowing terrible things while pretending ignorance, had been lifted permanently. Tyler appeared beside me, having watched the entire trial from the gallery, and wrapped me in a hug that felt like coming home after a long, difficult journey. "Ready to go back to your regular life?" he asked. "I'm ready to go back to a life where environmental protection doesn't require family destruction," I said, "but I'd do it all again if I had to." The courthouse steps gradually emptied as reporters finished their interviews and spectators returned to their regular lives. But for me, walking away from that building meant walking toward a future where truth mattered more than family loyalty, where protecting public resources was worth personal sacrifice, and where calling someone a failure couldn't silence the evidence of their courage. 3 years after the trial, I stood knee-deep in the restored waters of Cascade River, watching silver salmon navigate upstream through channels that had been rebuilt according to proper environmental specifications. The morning mist hung low over the water, creating an almost ethereal quality to the scene, and I couldn't help but think about how different this moment felt from the devastation I'd documented years earlier. The restoration project had taken 18 months and cost the federal government nearly $4 million, all funded by the restitution Richard had been ordered to pay as part of his sentencing. Judge Thornton had given him 12 years in federal prison, a sentence that reflected both the severity of his crimes and his complete lack of remorse during the proceedings. The money he'd stolen through fraudulent contracts was now being used to repair the environmental damage he'd caused, creating a kind of poetic justice that felt more satisfying than simple punishment. Dr. Elena Vasquez crouched beside me, taking water quality measurements with equipment that looked far more sophisticated than anything I'd used during my initial investigation. Her research had expanded significantly since the trial, with federal grants allowing her to study the long-term effects of construction-related environmental damage on Pacific Northwest ecosystems. The dissolved oxygen levels are back within normal ranges, she said, checking her instruments with the methodical precision that had made her such an effective witness. It's remarkable how quickly nature can recover when given proper conditions. I nodded, watching a great blue heron wade slowly through the shallows, hunting for fish in waters that 3 years ago had been too contaminated to support aquatic life. The restoration work had involved removing tons of construction debris, replanting native vegetation along the riverbanks, and installing specialized erosion control systems that would protect the watershed for decades to come. The Cascade River project had become something of a model for environmental restoration after criminal damage, with EPA officials bringing visitors from across the country to see how federal restitution funds could be used effectively. My role as environmental consultant on the restoration had evolved into something approaching expertise in post-criminal remediation, a specialty I'd never planned to develop but had found deeply meaningful. "Ms. Brooks, could you join us for a moment?" called Dr. James Whitfield, the federal project director who'd overseen the restoration from its planning stages through completion. He stood on the riverbank with a small group of people I didn't immediately recognize, all carrying official-looking notebooks and wearing the kind of sturdy outdoor clothing that suggested government employees on field assignments. I waded back to shore, my waterproof boots squelching against the muddy bottom that was slowly developing the complex ecosystem necessary for healthy salmon spawning. The restoration hadn't just involved cleaning up damage, it had required rebuilding entire habitat structures from the ground up, creating conditions that would support wildlife for generations. "These folks are from the Department of Justice's Environmental Crimes section," Dr. Whitfield explained as I approached. "They're documenting the restoration project as part of a case study on using criminal restitution for environmental repair." The lead investigator, a woman named Sarah Martinez who looked about my age, shook my hand with the firm grip of someone accustomed to dealing with serious matters. "Ms. Brooks, your testimony was instrumental in securing the conviction that made this restoration possible. We're hoping you might share some insights about the long-term impact of environmental crime prosecution." Over the next hour, I found myself describing not just the technical aspects of the restoration work, but the broader implications of holding environmental criminals accountable through the justice system. The conversation covered everything from deterrent effects on other potential violators to the importance of victim impact statements that included environmental damage alongside human harm. "One thing that surprised me," I told the group, "was how many other environmental consultants and construction workers reached out after Richard's conviction. People who'd witnessed similar violations but hadn't known how to report them or hadn't believed anything would be done about it." Sarah Martinez made notes while I spoke, her questions revealing a deep understanding of both environmental law and the practical challenges of prosecuting cases that involved complex technical evidence. The Justice Department was clearly taking environmental crime more seriously than they had in previous decades, treating ecosystem damage with the same gravity as financial fraud or violent crime. The restoration site visit concluded with group photographs and exchanges of contact information, but as the official delegation prepared to leave, Sarah Martinez lingered behind to continue our conversation privately. "Ms. Brooks, I have to ask about the personal cost of your decision to cooperate with federal prosecutors. From what I understand, it essentially ended your relationship with most of your extended family." I looked back at the restored river, where salmon were now swimming freely through channels that existed because someone had been willing to challenge criminal behavior, even when that someone was family. "The personal cost was significant," I said honestly, "but the cost of staying silent would have been higher." The truth was that my relationship with the Hartwell side of my family had never recovered from Richard's conviction and imprisonment. Diane had moved to Arizona to live with her sister, selling the family home and severing all ties with Cedar Falls. Brandon had eventually found work with a solar installation company in Eugene, apparently having learned something from his father's downfall about the value of legitimate environmental work. My mother Linda had struggled the most with the aftermath, caught between pride in my courage and grief over the family divisions that resulted from it. She'd maintained relationships with both sides, serving as a bridge between those who supported my decision and those who viewed it as unforgivable betrayal. Holiday gatherings had become complicated negotiations involving careful guest lists and unspoken agreements not to discuss certain topics. "Do you ever regret exposing your uncle's crimes?" Sarah Martinez asked. "I regret that crimes were committed in the first place," I said. "I regret that environmental protection and family loyalty had to be competing values. But I don't regret choosing to protect public resources over private relationships." After the Justice Department team departed, I remained at the restoration site for another hour, partly because the work still fascinated me, and partly because returning to this place had become a form of meditation. The trial and its aftermath had changed me in ways that were still evolving, transforming my understanding of courage, integrity, and the sometimes painful necessity of choosing principles over people. My phone buzzed with a text message from Tyler, who was finishing up his own environmental consulting work at a wind farm installation site about 50 miles east. "How did the DOJ visit go? Dinner at that new place in Bend?" Tyler and I had married 18 months after Richard's sentencing, in a small ceremony beside the Mackenzie River that included Dr. Vasquez as one of our witnesses and Agent Kim as an honored guest. Our relationship had been strengthened rather than damaged by the ordeal, largely because Tyler had understood from the beginning that environmental protection wasn't just my profession, but my calling. I drove back toward Bend through mountain roads lined with late-season wildflowers, thinking about the different paths my life might have taken if I'd chosen family harmony over environmental advocacy. It was possible to imagine versions of myself that had stayed quiet about Richard's crimes, that had prioritized keeping peace at family reunions over protecting salmon spawning grounds. Those alternative versions might have enjoyed easier relationships with relatives, might have avoided the stress and public scrutiny that came with federal prosecutions, might have lived more conventional lives without the complications that arise when moral convictions collide with family loyalty. But they also would have been versions of myself that could have looked at environmental destruction and chosen to remain silent. The restaurant Tyler had suggested was a farm-to-table place that specialized in locally sourced ingredients and sustainable cooking practices, the kind of establishment that probably wouldn't have existed in Central Oregon 20 years ago, but now reflected changing values about environmental responsibility. We were seated at a table near windows that overlooked the Deschutes River, another waterway that benefited from federal environmental protections. The Justice Department people seemed impressed with the restoration work. I told Tyler as we shared an appetizer of locally foraged mushrooms. They're planning to use the Cascade River project as a template for other criminal restitution cases. That's amazing, Nat. Your uncle's crimes are literally being used to protect other ecosystems. I'd never thought about it quite that way, but Tyler was right. Richard's conviction had created legal precedents and procedural frameworks that were now being applied to environmental crimes across the country. Federal prosecutors had more confidence in pursuing complex cases involving technical evidence, environmental consultants had clearer guidelines for reporting suspected violations, and judges had better tools for crafting restitution orders that addressed ecological damage. "I got a call from Carmen today," Tyler continued, referring to my aunt who had maintained supportive contact throughout the ordeal. "She wanted to let you know that Helen's doing well at the assisted living facility, and that she's been telling everyone there about her granddaughter who works with the FBI. My grandmother's pride in my choices had been one of the few unambiguously positive family reactions to the prosecution. At 94, Helen Hartwell had outlived most of her contemporaries and seemed to view Richard's downfall as confirmation of moral principles she'd been advocating for decades. Her support had meant more to me than criticism from relatives who thought family loyalty should trump legal accountability. Carmen also mentioned that Brandon's engaged, Tyler added carefully, to someone he met through his environmental work. I felt a complex mixture of emotions at that news. Brandon's cooperation with prosecutors had been legally necessary but personally devastating, forcing him to choose between protecting his father and acknowledging his own participation in criminal activity. His decision to pursue legitimate environmental work afterward suggested that the prosecution had achieved its intended deterrent effect, but I couldn't help wondering whether our family relationships would ever recover from the choices we'd all been forced to make. Dinner continued with conversations about Tyler's renewable energy projects and my expanding consulting practice, but underneath our professional discussions was the ongoing reality of living with decisions that had permanent consequences. Neither of us regretted the path we'd chosen, but we'd both learned that doing the right thing doesn't eliminate the complexity of human relationships or the sadness that comes with necessary losses. Walking back to our car after dinner, we passed a group of teenagers volunteering for a river cleanup project, their matching t-shirts identifying them as members of the local high school environmental club. They were pulling trash from the Deschutes River, while adult supervisors offered encouragement and instruction about aquatic ecosystem protection. One of the teenagers, a girl who couldn't have been older than 16, approached us with the confident enthusiasm that comes from believing individual actions can create meaningful change. "Excuse me, are you Natalie Brooks, the environmental consultant who exposed those construction crimes?" I nodded, still surprised when strangers recognized me from news coverage that had faded from public attention months earlier. "I'm writing a research paper about environmental whistleblowing for my AP Environmental Science class," the girl continued. "Could I ask you what advice you'd give to someone who discovers environmental crimes but isn't sure how to report them?" The question made me think about all the environmental consultants, construction workers, and government employees who'd contacted me after Richard's conviction, describing similar situations where they'd witnessed violations but hadn't known how to respond. The prosecution had apparently inspired other people to come forward with evidence of environmental crimes, creating a ripple effect that extended far beyond our family drama. "Document everything you can safely document," I told her. "Take photographs, keep records, and contact federal authorities who specialize in environmental crimes. Don't assume someone else will handle it, and don't let personal relationships prevent you from protecting public resources. Even if reporting crimes might hurt people you care about." "Especially then," I said, "because environmental damage hurts everyone, including future generations who can't speak for themselves." The girl thanked me and returned to her cleanup work, but our brief conversation stayed with me during the drive home to our small house on the outskirts of Bend. The question about hurting people you care about had been the central moral dilemma of my entire experience, and I was still learning to live with the tension between personal loyalty and public responsibility. Tyler and I had purchased our house partly because it included enough land for a small organic garden and a workshop where he could experiment with renewable energy technologies. The property also bordered a protected wetland that provided habitat for numerous bird species, giving us daily reminders of why environmental protection mattered beyond abstract principles. That evening, I sat on our back porch with a cup of tea, watching great horned owls hunt in the wetland, while Tyler worked on solar panel configurations in his workshop. The peace of the moment felt earned rather than accidental, a form of contentment that had developed slowly as the immediate trauma of the prosecution faded into broader perspective about the importance of environmental advocacy. My phone rang with a call from Agent Kim, who had become something approaching a friend during the years since Richard's conviction. She now specialized in training other federal agents to handle environmental crime cases, using the Hartwell prosecution as a case study in building complex cases with civilian cooperation. "Natalie, I wanted to give you a heads up about something," she said. "Richard's applying for early release based on good behavior and health concerns. The Bureau of Prisons is soliciting victim impact statements as part of their review process." The news didn't surprise me. Richard was now 68 years old, and 12 years in federal prison was a significant sentence for someone his age. The question was whether his early release would serve justice or simply reward him for avoiding additional disciplinary problems while incarcerated. "What kind of health concerns?" I asked. "Diabetes complications and early signs of cardiovascular disease. Nothing immediately life-threatening, but conditions that are harder to manage in prison than in civilian healthcare settings." I found myself thinking about Richard's wife Diane, who was now in her 60s and living alone in Arizona, while her husband served time for crimes that had destroyed their family's reputation and financial security. Early release might allow them to rebuild some form of life together, but it would also mean Richard avoiding full accountability for environmental damage that would take decades to repair completely. The victim impact statement process includes environmental damage as well as financial harm, Agent Kim continued. Your perspective as someone who documented the ecological consequences would be valuable for the review board. After we hung up, I sat quietly in the gathering darkness, listening to owl calls and the distant sound of wind through the protected wetland behind our property. The decision about whether to support or oppose Richard's early release felt like another test of the same principles that had guided my original cooperation with federal investigators. 3 weeks later, I submitted a detailed victim impact statement that focused not on personal grievances or family dynamics, but on the environmental damage that would persist long after Richard's release. I described the ongoing restoration work, the wildlife populations that were still recovering, and the federal resources that had been diverted from other conservation projects to repair the damage his crimes had caused. The statement concluded with a recommendation that Richard's release be contingent on continued participation in environmental restoration work, allowing him to contribute personally to repairing the damage he'd caused rather than simply serving time without direct connection to his victims. 6 months later, Richard was granted early release with conditions that included 5 years of supervised probation and 200 hours of community service with environmental restoration projects. The decision felt like an appropriate balance between mercy and accountability, offering him a chance to contribute positively while ensuring that his crimes weren't forgotten or minimized. I never spoke with Richard directly about his release or his community service work, but Agent Kim occasionally updated me on his progress with restoration projects in Eastern Oregon. According to her reports, he'd become a reliable volunteer who worked without complaint on manual labor that was far removed from the executive authority he'd once wielded. The final chapter of our family's story was still being written, with relationships that remained complicated and consequences that continued evolving. But standing in the restored waters of Cascade River, watching salmon swim freely through channels that existed because someone had chosen courage over comfort, I felt confident that the choices I'd made were ones I could live with for the rest of my life. Environmental protection wasn't just my profession anymore, it was my legacy. And sometimes legacy requires sacrificing the approval of people you love, for the sake of principles that matter more than personal comfort. The salmon swimming upstream didn't know about family reunions, or federal prosecutions, or the complexity of choosing justice over loyalty. They only knew that the water was clean again, the spawning grounds were restored, and the future was possible. That was enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.